There are very strong parallels between your story and Sarah's. You were a film producer at the top of your game, working on an Oscar-winning film. In fact, Sarah is an ambitious producer. How much do these stories show how sexual abuse isn't just an act that happens in a moment, but that actually it steals women's powers, their dreams, their careers, ultimately?
Yeah, exactly. That's kind of what I wanted to capture, because I think oftentimes when you hear kind of everyday conversation about sexual assault, people might say, "Oh, it was one night that went badly. Why are victims going on about it?" And I think unless you've actually experienced it or know much more about the topic, you don't realize that it affects the rest of your life, right? Yes, there's the PTSD, the anxiety, the depression that happens. But my own career pretty much crumbled as a result of my rape, and my rape didn't even take place in the context of film. But for me, I was unable to continue working because of the PTSD. I couldn't be at the top of my game as a producer anymore. And then because of the way the film industry works, it was quite hard to get back in and get a job. So I basically had to stop producing afterwards. And if I look back on it, I'm like, oh no, that was an entire career that just went down the drain because of the actions of another person. So there is that career aspect. There's also the financial aspect, because if you're not working, then you're not earning money, and then basically that you don't have capital that's compounding in a bank account, right? So 10 years down the line, you're probably worse off than if that hadn't happened to you. Not to mention the emotional, the psychological, the inability to trust people afterwards that happens.
Do you think there's something in particular about industries like the film industry, industries that are pretty difficult to get into, so that once you're there, once you get your place on the rung, you desperately want to hang on to it, and perhaps prepared. Obviously, this wasn't your situation, but it is partly what's described in the book. You're therefore prepared to put up, and that, which is what Me Too highlighted in many ways, put up with quite a bit before you have to go, that's it, that's enough.
Yeah, exactly. It's an industry that's so hard to get your foot in the door unless you have an existing connection, that once you have your foot in the door, once you have that, rung on the ladder, you're kind of hanging on for dear life. There's a huge amount of precarity in the creative industries, as you might know, but where if you screw up once and an angry boss says that's it, you're out of a job, it's really hard to get back in. So I think for me, that's what the book was about. Like, Sarah Lai has to try so hard to get in the industry that once she's there, she doesn't want to anger her boss or bosses, because that her only way forward is to continue to please the people above her to get more opportunities.
And do you think that that's something that's then used cynically? Because, obviously sexual assault and rape has much more to do with power than it has to do with sex in a way. And if there are people in powerful positions who recognise that there's a vulnerability that they can take advantage of, then they do.
Yeah. I mean, that's completely what Weinstein was doing, for example. Like, he would invite young women to his hotel room or to have a meeting. And he knew, because of his power, of course, no, you wouldn't turn down a meeting with Weinstein, because that could be your big break. That could be him saying, okay, let's do business together. And there's been a huge amount of media coverage around that. So he exactly knew what he was doing in terms of inviting women into a space where they were vulnerable and then capitalizing on that sexually, and then also threatening them afterwards and saying, well, you can't talk about this, because if you do, you're never going to get a job in this town. So I wanted to look at how much that silencing is part of the power structure, and how much things like NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, are used to continue perpetrating this power structure.
Funnily enough, we talked about NDAs the other day in universities, and just we've got an MP, Layla Moran, here in this country, just questioning why on earth they would be considered appropriate, after a sexual assault has occurred. Complicit, your book couldn't be more timely, given, I suppose, the conviction of Ghislaine Maxwell this week, who trafficked women and young girls for her husband, Jeffrey Epstein. I'm not sure she ever married him. But tell us how you explore how men and even senior female producers, which is one of the shocking things, turn a blind eye to abuse in the workplace against younger women. They're described as fodder in one scene in the book.
Yeah, I think for me, and there's you have to realize there's kind of a sliding scale, or there's a spectrum on which this kind of abuse happens. So on the far end, you have rape and sexual abuse, right? But on the other end, you have kind of everyday kind of comments or casual sexual harassment, which happens, so frequently that it becomes nothing that you even comment about, right? So there's a scene where Sarah is, listening in on basically a conversation between a male director and a male producer, and they're just discussing the women's headshots and just talking about how hot these women are and what they would do to them. And she basically has to put up with it. I mean, you just sort of listen to that kind of everyday conversation where women are constantly being objectified. So it's an entire environment where women are objectified. And then that continues on. So it's I guess I want to look at how you stay silent, you put up with certain things, and then that continues, that gets pushed further and further, that boundary in terms of where you're going to draw the line and say, like, actually, no, that's not okay. So by the time it gets to a point where you're with a boss that you've been working with for months or years, and they ask you to do something, you just don't want to anger them because, you're going to be out of a job, right?
So what do you think actually needs to change? Because, of course, there was a huge sort of explosion of testimonies and activity around Me Too and hashtag everything. And it felt like this was going to be a tipping point. This was going to be a moment of change. And I can't help feeling that nothing has really dramatically changed. I mean, if you were a young girl stepping into the film industry now, is there any more protection for you than there ever was? There's this culture of complicity that I'm not sure has actually, I mean, people might be slightly more aware of it, slightly more careful about covering up their activities. But do you think that it's actually changed fundamentally?
Possibly in LA, because you've just got more money in that industry, so there's more resources to put systemic change in place. So you have intimacy coordinators on set when there's sex scenes being filmed, which didn't happen pre-Me Too. You have much more of an emphasis on gender equality and racial equality in terms of casting and who gets directing positions and jobs like that. But I mean, if you look at the perpetrators themselves, it's just Weinstein who's served time in prison. And
I mean, if you look at the Jeffrey Epstein case, it's Ghislaine Maxwell.
Yeah, it's not even Epstein. And so finally, I mean, I think just last night, R. Kelly, the rapper, who also has his own history of abuse, was finally sentenced to 30 years in prison for constant abuse of young black women and girls. But those are the only two people. I mean, Cosby's no longer in prison, right? So we're talking about three people who are sort of possibly the figureheads of what the Me Too movement was about. But there are many, many other perpetrators out there who haven't really been held to account.
I did want to ask you about that because, of course, as you say, R. Kelly, Harvey Weinstein, Jeffrey Epstein, Bill Cosby, we've heard all those names, and they're powerful and they're great for headlines in newspapers. But in your opinion, is it just the tip of the iceberg? Because I can't help thinking that that those stories must echo the experiences of women in all kinds of other industries that don't attract the glamour and therefore the attention and therefore the media interest, perhaps, that the film industry does.
Yeah, and I think I was looking at that a bit in complicit because, Sarah herself is not famous, right? But she knows that there are other famous names. There's a very famous actress in the novel who possibly has her own story. So she knows that once that actress is introduced into the story, it's going to blow up the entire news cycle in some ways. And I think that is just, I mean, on a cynical level, you're exactly right. It's these names that have already been circulating, that already are headline fodder, that are the ones that are attracting attention. But if you think about all sorts of other industries, certainly less glamorous ones, restaurants or, factory work, things that are never going to get headlines because they're not glamorous, there must be huge amounts. I mean, we know there's huge amounts of abuse that happen there. Women who are illegal immigrants, who are in, precarious economic positions, they're very much vulnerable to sexual abuse at the hands of men that are their bosses.
Do you think the media does enough? Because in a way, it's very easy to focus in on the big headline stories, the name-grabbing stories, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't think the media does enough. I mean, the media certainly gave a lot of attention to the Amber Heard-Johnny Depp case, which was quite revolting in a lot of ways in terms of the social media impact and the misogyny that was just so blatantly there. And you're led to wonder, what was this media fixation on the celebrity couple? Sure, yes, it called up other issues of domestic abuse, which lots of other couples around the world experience. But on the other hand, no, I think the media probably should be doing more undercover work in terms of other industries that are less glamorous.
But you then wrote a book, Dark Chapter, about your experience where you explored what had happened through the eyes of both the victim of the rape and the perpetrator. How difficult was that for you to imagine yourself into his mind?
I suppose as a writer, I just found it intriguing, right? Maybe it's a little bit more, but I don't know. But I mean, I suppose if you live through a trauma that significant, you're constantly sort of thinking about it. You're constantly trying to wonder, like, how did this happen? How did I get here? I mean, on April 10th, I was perfectly fine and working as a film producer and living in London as a 29-year-old. And then on April 13th, I was a rape victim and I was constantly having to speak to the police. So my entire life ended as I knew it as a result of the rape. So I was just trying to make sense of that whole situation. And obviously, with this kind of crime, it is caused by the perpetrator. So I was walking through a park and I crossed paths with a 15-year-old boy who had a conversation with me. It was a very strange conversation. And then little to my knowledge, he kept following me. And then eventually, when we were in a very remote area of the park, he attacked me. And, I was violently raped and there were 39 injuries, according to the police reports. And I was just like, how did a 15-year-old boy do that, right? How was I kind of outsmarted, although that's not the right word to use, by this 15-year-old boy? And how did my life change so fundamentally because of this stranger? So I wanted to try to make sense of his character, or a character that could have been him. Because he was a stranger, I knew very few facts about him, but I took about the 5 facts I knew, and I constructed him and I made him one of the protagonists of Dark Chapter because I wanted to try to imagine what had happened in his life that had led him to committing that act against me, right? And certainly from the assault itself, it's he seemed quite practiced in terms of how to intimidate women. He had said things that implied that he'd been exposed to pornography, right? So, I mean, I wanted to see, like, how could a 15-year-old boy, evolve into that over the course of just 15 years? Like, what had he been exposed to? How did he develop this kind of value system, I suppose, around women? But at the same time, I wanted to make him empathetic because, he's a human being.
What were the conclusions that you came to in terms of how that sort of act could have been normalized?
I mean, I don't know if I want to say conclusion. That sounds quite scientific. I mean, I suppose it was, in the book, I imagined that he'd had experiences of domestic abuse within his household, right? So he possibly grew up in a very gender extreme household where women were expected to do certain things. And again, I'm stressing this as a fictional character because I don't know him. And he had an older brother, who exposed him to crime and violence and pornography at an early age. So I kind of tried to make sense of this young boy who was possibly already being led astray by an older brother and by, a semi-absent violent father.
Incredibly generous of you. I think that the boy who raped you in the end we were talking about Bill Cosby already being out, and I think he went to jail for 4 years. Is that right in the end?
He was sentenced to 8 and he served 4. Yeah. And I recently found out he's been accused of other assaults in Northern Ireland.
Subsequent, after his release.
Yeah, as recently as this January, which is 13 years after he was convicted of my rape. So,
and I mean, at the time, did you feel that 4 years was the right sort of sentence for what you'd experienced?
No, I mean, but it's quite arbitrary because if you look in other countries, he would have gotten 20 years. Maybe in other countries, it would have gotten nothing, right? And then I know so many other victims and survivors who didn't have their rapist convicted, and therefore that person never served any time. So, yeah, I didn't feel it was enough, but I also felt, we're working within a very arbitrary criminal justice system in some ways.
In your book, though, interestingly, your first book, you zoom in more on the aftermath of the rape, of the support that you didn't get and the way people dealt with it. Why was that very important to you to look at?
I guess I wanted to show the cracks in the system, right? And most survivors I've spoken to have some complaint or many complaints about how they were treated afterwards by the public systems, whether that's the police or the criminal justice system or, doctors or hospitals. And there just seemed to be overall a lack of care. I had a very good experience with the police service of Northern Ireland, but a less great experience with the rape crisis center that I went to, right? And for me, it was just shocking that given how frequent this crime is, and we know, people say 1 in 5, 1 in 4 women will experience sexual assault. Given how frequent it is, that the level of care out there is so unsympathetic, and that bad care and that bad handling of victims can actually perpetuate the trauma in a lot of ways and make it harder to recover.
The level of care, but also the level of convictions. I mean, in the UK, in the year to September 2021, just 1.3% of rape cases recorded by police resulted in a suspect being charged or receiving a summons. I wonder if you'd experienced the thing that many women or many victims of sexual assault talk about, which is the fact that their credibility is questioned and their history is looked at, and there's every effort seemingly made to discredit the crime that's happened.
I didn't experience that, and I think I was quite lucky because of the really stark difference. He was a 15-year-old boy who didn't have a formal education, whose family had links with crime. I'm very at the time I was a well-educated 29-year-old professional American woman, right? So who are the police going to believe there, right? Who's going to seem more credible? And it's simply because of these inequalities in where we are in society that victims and perpetrators are judged. So if you look at the flip case, a very, Epstein, or like a very, very established, wealthy, privileged male, and a less established woman, which is essentially what complicit is about, then who are you going to believe there, right? So I think, we have to be really critical about every single case that happens. That dynamic between the victim and the perpetrator is held up to scrutiny and often, unfortunately, leads to certain people seen as being more credible or others less.
Complicit is going to be turned into a film, quite ironically, in a way, as I understand. Is it?
Well, we don't know yet.
I'm sure it will be.
I hope so. But I'm working on the screenplay for Dark Chapter, so we're on the way there. But obviously, I know as a producer, it can take a very long time for a book to be turned into a film. So I've got my fingers crossed.
And how much, just finally, do you carry the weight of that thing that happened to you with you? Do you think that it's going to be the subject matter that you're going to keep looking at from many different angles throughout your writing and your creative career, because it has had such an incredibly profound impact on who you are?
I mean, it's an interesting question because as an artist or a writer, I would there are other stories I want to tell, right? It's not, I don't want to be constantly writing about rape and sexual violence. But on the other hand, as somebody who's lived through that and knows how prevalent and how life-changing that experience is, I do feel it does need to be spoken about in a way that's realistic, that does that does service to the victim and the survivor's experience. So, yeah, in my next novel, which I'm currently writing, it kind of creeps in, even though I wasn't expecting it. But then you're like, but that's real, right? Because there's lots of other people out there who've gone on to do interesting things and have great lives, but they are also victims of sexual assault, and that does also impact the rest of their lives.